Have you ever stopped to wonder what it truly means to live a fulfilling life as the years go by? Is it about keeping busy, surrounding yourself with family, or simply making it through each day? Or is the secret to lasting happiness and peace hidden in something far more profound, something many of us overlook until it's almost too late? Today, we journey through the inspiring life of a woman named Imo, a woman who didn't just accept aging, she embraced it. She turned it into something meaningful, something beautiful, something liberating. Through her experiences, she discovered that true joy isn't found in clinging to family or surrendering independence. Instead, it lies in carving out a life of passion, purpose, and freedom on your own terms. By following her story, you'll uncover the secret to thriving in later years, the delicate balance between independence and meaningful connections, the importance of chasing the dreams that set your soul on fire, and the undeniable power of self-care and self-love. More importantly, you'll see how the seemingly small choices we make each day can lead to profound transformations, shaping not just our own happiness, but inspiring those around us. Imo once said something so simple yet so powerful. I finally realized that to live a truly happy life in my old age, I don't need my children, nor do I need wealth. What I need are just three things. A lifetime of sacrifices had brought her to this realization, and in the process, she discovered what truly matters. Not just in old age, but in life itself. What were these three treasures that changed everything for her? How did she uncover them through years of struggle, loss, and perseverance? For decades, Imo devoted herself entirely to the happiness of others. She was a mother who gave and gave, pouring every ounce of her love and energy into her children, her family, and the people around her. In doing so, she unknowingly faded into the background of her own life, always prioritizing others' needs while neglecting her own. She became someone who existed only in the service of others, her own dreams and desires lost beneath the weight of responsibility. But as the years passed, a deep, unshakable realization settled in. Parents, especially mothers, often give so much of themselves that they forget who they are. They believe that love is measured by sacrifice, that their happiness should be secondary to the needs of their children. But the truth Imo finally understood was that the greatest gift she could offer her loved ones wasn't relentless sacrifice. It was the courage to love herself first, to prioritize her own joy, and to walk a path that was truly hers. It took her years to accept this truth, but once she did, everything changed. When she stopped chasing happiness outside of herself and began to nurture it from within, she experienced a transformation unlike any other. Through this journey, she uncovered the three greatest treasures of her later years, treasures that weren't tied to material wealth or status, but ones that were deeply personal, profoundly powerful, and rooted in self-love. She learned that the key to happiness isn't in following the expectations of society, nor in holding on to outdated beliefs about duty and sacrifice. True fulfillment comes when we listen to our own hearts, embrace our own experiences, and make choices that nourish our souls. Perhaps the most profound lesson she learned was this: preparing for old age isn't about accumulating money or possessions. It's about preparing yourself, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, for the next chapter of life. It's about shedding the idea that we must always put others first, that our worth is determined by how much we give away. The truth is, we are worthy of joy and peace just as we are, without having to prove anything to anyone. As I reflect on Imo's journey, I feel a deep sense of admiration for her. She reminds us that life isn't a race to some distant finish line. It's a process of self-discovery and growth. She teaches us that aging isn't something to fear, but something to embrace with wisdom and grace. And most importantly, she challenges us to rethink what it means to truly live. Her story is a testament to the idea that peace isn't found in the noise of obligation, but in the quiet moments of self-reflection. She invites us to let go of the belief that we must always sacrifice for the sake of others, and instead urges us to honor ourselves, to embrace solitude when needed, and to find joy in our own company. At 68 years old, Imo closed the doors to the small restaurant she had run for 34 years in the heart of Asakusa, Tokyo. It was a bittersweet moment, but it was also the day she finally learned the most valuable lesson of her life. Mom, from now on, take it easy. Come live with us. We'll take care of you. Her eldest daughter, Haruka, said gently, her voice filled with love and concern. "Yes, Mom, come stay with me. The kids would love to spend more time with their grandmother," added Yuki, the younger of the two daughters, her face bright with eagerness. Both of them spoke with the same tender worry, their words filled with genuine care. They had watched their mother work tirelessly for decades, pouring herself into the lives of others, and now, in her later years, they wanted to give her the rest and comfort they believed she deserved. But as their words hung in the air, Imo only smiled, a small, knowing smile that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of understanding. There was something serene in her expression, as if she had already made peace with a decision they could not yet comprehend. 34 years ago, her life had been turned upside down. The sudden loss of her husband in a tragic accident had left her alone with two small daughters to raise. It was the darkest, most painful chapter of her life, but through sheer willpower, she refused to crumble under its weight. Instead of turning to others for help, she dug deep within herself. She opened a small roadside restaurant where she prepared simple but nourishing meals. Rice, miso soup, the kind of food that warmed the soul. Day in and day out, she worked tirelessly, her hands roughened by labor, her back aching from exhaustion. But her heart remained focused on one thing: her daughter's future. Every single yen she earned went toward their education, their well-being, their dreams. She saved, she sacrificed, and she endured, all to give them the best possible start in life. When they grew up and started families of their own, she continued to put their happiness before her own, never once considering that she too was worthy of joy. But now, standing before her daughters as they pleaded with her to come live with them, she realized that it was time to make a different choice. A choice not based on duty or obligation, but on what her heart truly needed. With a gentle but firm voice, she finally spoke. "Don't worry about me," she said, her tone calm and assured. "I can take care of myself." Her daughters exchanged confused glances, unable to understand why she was turning down their offer of comfort and ease. After all, hadn't she spent her entire life struggling? Hadn't she earned the right to be cared for? But Imo saw things differently. She had spent decades learning one profound truth: people are happiest and strongest when they rely on themselves. "You two have built your own lives," she continued, looking at her daughters with deep love. "Now it's time for me to find my own peace, my own joy, without being a burden on anyone." Haruka and Yuki couldn't quite grasp the depth of their mother's quiet strength, but in the weeks that followed, they received a photo of her standing in a beautiful field in Nagano, a radiant smile on her face. In that moment, they understood. Their mother had found happiness, not by clinging to them, but by embracing her own path, by standing on her own feet, by choosing independence. And with that understanding came a deep respect, a realization that the greatest lesson their mother had ever taught them wasn't about sacrifice. It was about self-love and the courage to live life on one's own terms. As the seasons changed, so did Imo's life. For the first time in decades, she was no longer bound by the routine of running her restaurant, no longer waking up before sunrise to prepare meals for customers, no longer feeling the weight of responsibility that had been her constant companion for so long. But this newfound freedom didn't feel empty or lonely. It felt like an open door to a life she had never allowed herself to explore. She had spent her entire existence nurturing others, and now she realized it was time to nurture herself. The first step in this journey was taking care of her health. For years, her body had carried the burden of exhaustion, long hours of standing, bending, lifting, and walking. It wasn't until she stepped away from the restaurant that she truly felt the toll it had taken. The persistent ache in her back, the stiffness in her shoulders, the fatigue that seemed to settle in her bones. These were things she had ignored, pushing through the pain because there was always something more important to do. But now she had time, and she made a promise to herself: "I will not spend my old age in pain." Every morning she whispered a quiet commitment. "Today I will move my body." It started small, a short walk around the neighborhood, slow and deliberate, her legs stiff from years of neglect. At first it was uncomfortable, even painful, but she didn't let that stop her. Each day she pushed a little further. She found joy in feeling the sun on her skin, the crisp air filling her lungs. Component placement, the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. Weeks passed, and her body responded. The pain in her back eased. Her movements became lighter. She felt a shift, not just physically, but emotionally, like she was shedding the weight of years spent prioritizing everything but herself. Then one morning, as she rested on a park bench, an elderly woman approached her with a warm smile. "I see you walking here every day," the woman said. "Would you like to join our yoga club? It's gentle, nothing too strenuous. Just a way to keep our bodies moving." Imo hesitated for only a moment before nodding. And just like that, another door opened. Her first yoga class was awkward, to say the least. Her body, unused to stretching and bending in such ways, resisted at every turn. But as she watched the other women, some even older than her, move with grace and ease, she felt a quiet determination settle in her heart. With time, she improved. Her posture straightened, her movements became more fluid, and she started feeling a connection with her body that she hadn't felt in years. Then, during one class, as she held a deep stretch, a thought crossed her mind. One so simple, yet so profound, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "For so long, I thought my health was something my children would take care of. I thought it was something I could ignore until it became their problem. But now I see, my health is my responsibility, my greatest asset, and I will never make others carry the burden of my neglect." That realization changed everything. She began prioritizing nutritious meals, not out of duty, but out of love for herself. She paid closer attention to how she moved, how she rested, how she treated the body that had carried her through so much. She wasn't just preparing for old age anymore, she was preparing to live. But Imo's transformation wasn't just physical. As she grew stronger, so did her sense of connection with the world around her. One day, during one of her walks, she saw a sign posted on a bulletin board: "Volunteers needed, community garden project." Without hesitation, she signed up. On her first day, she was assigned the simple task of pulling weeds. Tedious, repetitive work, but something about it felt grounding, almost meditative. She worked silently until she heard a small voice beside her. "Grandma, am I doing this right?" She turned to see a little boy, no older than 8, struggling with a tiny shovel. His face was scrunched in determination, his small hands gripping the tool with uncertainty. A soft smile spread across her face as she reached over, guiding his hands, showing him the right way to hold it. "There," she said gently, "like this. Now try again." And just like that, something shifted. Over the weeks, she found herself forming unexpected connections, not just with the children who came to help plant flowers, but with the other volunteers as well. A group of older women welcomed her into their circle, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple joy of working together. One afternoon, as she carefully watered a patch of blooming daisies, an older woman beside her asked, "Do you have a garden at home?" Imo chuckled. "I've never grown anything before," she admitted, "but being here, watching these flowers thrive, it makes me feel like I've started a new chapter of my life." And she had. In those moments, Imo realized something she had never considered before. The greatest fear in old age isn't loneliness. It's feeling like you have no purpose. By opening herself up to new experiences, by stepping outside of her comfort zone, she had found a sense of belonging that went beyond family, beyond obligation. She shared this insight during a volunteer gathering, her voice steady but full of conviction. "Loneliness isn't about being alone," she said. "It's about feeling like you no longer matter. When you find a way to contribute, to connect, to give something of yourself to the world, you will never be truly alone." And with that, she had discovered her second treasure: the power of relationships. But Imo's journey wasn't over yet, because there was still one thing she had never allowed herself to pursue. One dream she had buried beneath the weight of duty, telling herself it was impractical, unrealistic. Until one day, she finally gave herself permission. At the age of 68, she walked into a small music school and signed up for piano lessons. Her daughters were stunned. "Mom, piano?" "At your age?" Imo simply smiled. "Why not?" The first few weeks were humbling. Her fingers stumbled over the keys, her movements awkward and slow. The simple act of reading sheet music felt like deciphering a foreign language. But she kept going. Every day she sat at the piano, practicing the most basic scales over and over. Her hands ached, her mind resisted, but she refused to give up. And then, one evening, something magical happened. As her fingers glided over the keys, the notes came together in a way they never had before. It wasn't just sound, it was music. For the first time in decades, she wasn't playing a role dictated by life's demands. She was doing something purely for herself, something that made her heart swell with joy. And with that, she had found her third treasure, the pursuit of passion. Emo's days took on a new rhythm, one filled with quiet joys that had nothing to do with duty or expectation. Every morning, she rose early, greeted the day with a few gentle stretches, and then set out for her walk. Her steps were no longer heavy with exhaustion, but light with purpose. She would stop by the park, sometimes meeting familiar faces, exchanging a warm smile or a kind word, but mostly she enjoyed the solitude, the stillness, the way the breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers. It was during these walks that she felt most at peace, most connected to herself. In the afternoons, she continued her volunteer work at the community garden, where the once distant faces had now become friends. She found herself looking forward to these simple gatherings, to the small conversations that often led to laughter, to the unspoken understanding that came from working towards something meaningful together. The garden flourished under their care, but more than that, so did she. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing the plants thrive, about watching the children grow more confident in their efforts, about feeling a sense of belonging without the pressure of obligation. And then there was the piano. It had become more than just a hobby, it was her sanctuary. At first, she played only in the evenings, when the world outside quieted and she could lose herself in the music. But soon she found herself craving more. She would sit at the piano in the middle of the day, her fingers moving more fluidly over the keys, the melodies coming together with a grace she never thought possible. It wasn't about mastery, it was about the sheer joy of learning, the excitement of discovering something new, the feeling of being a beginner at something and knowing that was perfectly okay. Her daughters, though still puzzled by her refusal to live with them, had begun to understand. They no longer insisted that she move in, no longer questioned her choices. Instead, they marveled at her transformation. "Mom is so busy these days, she barely answers my calls," Yuki joked one afternoon, but there was no resentment in her voice, only admiration. They saw their mother thriving in a way they hadn't expected, and with that realization came a sense of relief. She wasn't lonely, she wasn't struggling. She had built a life that was full, independent, and completely her own. One weekend, as the family gathered at Emo's home for a meal, Haruka asked the question that had been lingering in her mind. "Mom, do you love living alone?" There was no urgency in her voice, no expectation, just genuine curiosity. Emo looked at her daughters, at the grandchildren playing in the yard, at the home she had created for herself, and smiled. "I love you both deeply," she said, her voice warm, steady. "Which is why I choose to keep some distance. Staying with you all the time wouldn't be love. It would be self-satisfaction. Love is also about giving each other space, about allowing each of us to live freely without feeling bound by obligation." Her daughters didn't respond right away, but the weight of her words settled in their hearts. Over time, they saw the wisdom in them. They realized that their mother wasn't rejecting them. She was teaching them something invaluable. That love isn't about being physically close all the time. It's about respect. It's about trust. It's about knowing that true closeness isn't measured by proximity, but by understanding. Months passed, and Imo continued to embrace her new life. Her days were filled with movement, connection, and purpose. But more than that, they were filled with a quiet contentment she had never known before. She no longer worried about the future, no longer felt the need to cling to what was familiar. She had built a life that felt whole, that felt true to who she was. And in doing so, she had given her daughters the greatest gift of all. Not just her love, but the example of a woman who had learned, at last, how to love herself. One afternoon, as she sat by the piano, her fingers effortlessly gliding over the keys, she reflected on how far she had come. She had once feared old age, had once believed that her worth was tied to how much she could give to others. But now she knew the truth. Aging wasn't something to dread, it was something to embrace. It was a chance to rediscover, to reinvent, to truly live. And as the music filled the room, she smiled, knowing that this life she had created, was hers, and hers alone. As the months passed, Emo's life became a beautiful balance of independence and connection. She found herself waking up each morning with purpose, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Her days were no longer dictated by obligations to others, but by her own desires, her own sense of fulfillment. She would start her mornings with yoga, a practice that had once felt foreign, but had now become a sacred ritual, a way to thank her body for carrying her through all these years. Her afternoons were spent in ways that enriched her soul. Some days she would immerse herself in music, her fingers dancing across the piano keys, relishing in the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful. Other days she would visit the community garden, where the once small and hesitant saplings had blossomed into vibrant flowers, much like the friendships she had formed. She laughed more now, felt lighter than she had in decades, as if she had shed the weight of expectations that had been pressing down on her shoulders for so long. And then, of course, there were the weekends. The time she set aside for family, but on her terms. Her daughters and grandchildren would gather at her home, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and connection. There was no sense of duty, no feeling of burden, only warmth. They shared stories, meals, laughter, and in those moments, Imo felt complete. She didn't need to see them every day to know they loved her. Their bond wasn't built on dependency, but on mutual respect, and that made it all the more precious. One evening, as the family sat around the table, Yuki suddenly spoke, her voice laced with quiet realization. "If Mum had moved in with us, I don't think she would be as happy as she is now." Haruka, stirring her tea, nodded in agreement. "She taught us something without even saying it," she added. "That happiness isn't about clinging to the past or relying on others to make us feel whole. It's about creating a life that feels true to you." And for the first time, they fully understood why their mother had chosen to live alone. Not because she didn't love them, but because she did. As Imo's life continued to unfold in its newfound freedom, she felt herself drawn to giving back in ways she had never considered before. She began volunteering at a local meal service for the elderly, a place where warm food was offered to those who had little else. At first, she simply wanted to help, but as the weeks went on, she realized she was receiving something just as valuable as she was giving. The gratitude in the eyes of those she served, the stories shared over simple bowls of soup, the knowledge that even in the smallest of ways she was making a difference. These things filled her heart in ways she hadn't expected. One day, as she handed a steaming bowl to an elderly man with kind, weary eyes, he grasped her hand gently and said, "You know, it's not just the food. It's the feeling that someone still sees us, still cares." His words stayed with her long after she had left for the day. It made her realize how easy it was to disappear in old age, how easy it was for people to forget that those who had once been strong and capable still had so much to offer, so much to feel. She refused to let that happen to herself. That evening, as she sat at her piano, she thought about all the ways she had been told, directly or indirectly, what aging was supposed to look like. That it was a time of slowing down, of stepping aside, of fading into the background. But she had found another way, a better way. Aging wasn't about disappearing, it was about evolving. It was about continuing to learn, to love, to give, to create. And as she played, the music filling the quiet space of her home, she knew with certainty that she had never felt more alive. As the seasons shifted, so did Imo's understanding of what it meant to truly live. She no longer feared growing older because she had come to realize that aging was not about decline, but about transformation. It was about learning to move with life rather than against it, about embracing the freedom that came with shedding the burdens of expectation. She had spent so many years believing that her role was to serve, to sacrifice, to ensure the well-being of others. But now she understood that true love, the kind that endures, that strengthens, wasn't about constantly giving, but about knowing when to step back, when to allow space, when to trust that those you love will find their own way. One afternoon, as she was organizing a drawer filled with keepsakes from her restaurant years, she stumbled upon a small savings book, the one she had quietly maintained for over 3 decades. It was a tangible record of every yen she had set aside, not for extravagance, but for security. She ran her fingers over the cover, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. She had always made sure that her daughters had what they needed, but in doing so, she had also prepared for herself. She had built her life in such a way that she would never have to rely on them for financial support, never have to become a burden. And as she held the book in her hands, she realized that this was one of her greatest treasures, not just the money itself, but the independence it symbolized. That evening Haruka visited, her face etched with concern. "Mum, one of my friend's mothers is in the hospital. The medical bills are overwhelming and her children are struggling to cover them." Imo listened quietly, her heart heavy with the weight of the story. Then, without hesitation, she walked over to the drawer, took out the savings book, and placed it gently in Haruka's hands. "I will never be a burden on you," she said softly, her voice steady but full of warmth. "This is my first treasure." Her daughter looked at her in quiet awe, realizing in that moment just how much wisdom and foresight her mother had carried all these years. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the responsibility, the awareness that true love isn't about clinging to others for support, but about ensuring that your presence in their life brings joy, not obligation. Imo had secured her future in a way that allowed her children to love her freely, without worry, without guilt. But independence wasn't just financial. Imo had come to understand that relationships were just as important. She had always believed that family was the foundation of love, but now she knew that friendships, true, deep, meaningful friendships, were just as vital. Through her volunteer work, through her music, through the simple act of opening herself up to new experiences, she had built a circle of people who valued her not for what she could do for them, but simply for who she was. Her hiking group had become an unexpected source of joy. Every month, she and a small group of friends would set out on trails, their laughter echoing through the trees, their conversations drifting effortlessly between the past and the present. These outings were more than just walks through nature. They were reminders that life didn't have to become smaller with age. If anything, it could expand. There was always more to see, more to feel, more to experience. One day, as they rested at the peak of a hill overlooking the city, one of her friends turned to her and said, "You know, Imo, I think you're the happiest person I know." She laughed, shaking her head. "Happiness isn't something you wait for," she replied. "It's something you choose. Every day." And that was the second treasure she had discovered, the treasure of relationships, of surrounding herself with people who made life richer, more meaningful. She had learned that loneliness didn't come from being alone, but from feeling as though you had no place, no purpose. And so, she had built a life where every moment felt purposeful, where every relationship was one she had chosen with intention. Her daughters, watching from the sidelines, marveled at this transformation. They had expected their mother to slow down, to settle into a quiet life of rest and stillness. Instead, she had become more active, more engaged, more alive than ever before. "Mom, you're busier now than when you ran the restaurant," Yuki teased one day, shaking her head in amusement. Imo only smiled. "That's because I'm finally living for myself." And with that, she had embraced the greatest truth of all, that life doesn't stop at a certain age, it only stops when we decide to stop growing. As Imo continued embracing her life with newfound purpose, she found herself more engaged with the world than ever before. She was no longer merely existing, she was thriving. Her piano practice, once a personal challenge, had now become something she deeply cherished. She had spent months struggling through the basics, her fingers slow and unsteady, but with time and patience, she had reached a point where she could play entire pieces from memory. What once seemed impossible had become second nature. One evening, as she sat at the piano, playing a melody she had long loved but never thought she would be able to perform, she felt something stir deep within her. It was a sense of accomplishment, of pride, not the kind that came from proving something to others, but the kind that came from proving something to herself. She had spent most of her life believing that certain dreams were meant only for the young, but now she knew the truth. It was never too late to start something new.